Firstly, welcome to this Law Society webinar on preparing second-year trainees for qualification. Today you'll hear from Husnara Begum, who will discuss options for those approaching qualification, looking to secure a newly qualified role. So I've got hay fever, I do apologise. I manage the Law Society's career service, and we're here to support you throughout your career. Our products and services provide support from pre-qualification right through to supporting you at all stages of your career once you're qualified. Amongst other things, we offer one-to-one advice via our free career clinics, led by qualified legal career coaches. On the website, you'll find career guidance and further information on our services, or you can always email us at careers@lawsociety.org.uk. A quick mention that our Junior Lawyers division represents you at the early stages of your career. Local groups can provide insight and also offer networking opportunities. You'll find more information and details of our local groups on the website. Just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Husnara. We'd encourage you to actively participate in today's session by asking questions. Please raise your hand via the icon at the top of the screen if you wish to ask a question. You'll then be selected, at which point please unmute your microphone. And can I please ask that everyone please ensure that microphones are on mute if you're not speaking, as it causes interference. If you would prefer, there is also the option to type questions in the chat box. If you have any technical issues, please post these in the chat box. One of our team will respond. I hope you find the session useful. Please be aware that it will be recorded. If you share your webcam, it may appear on the recording. I will now hand over to Husnara. Over to you, Husnara.
Thank you very much, Rita. There seems to be a bit of a delay. Apologies, by the way. The reason my eyes sometimes go to one side is because I'm controlling the slides from a different device, and there seems to be a bit of a time lag. Anyway, I'm Husnara, and let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was a lawyer. I trained at Linklaters, and then at 3 years PQE moved on from law to journalism and spent nearly a decade as a journalist on The Lawyer magazine. And it was at that point when I developed an interest in all things careers related. I left The Lawyer to pursue a new career yet again, and that time I joined a recruitment agency, this time more by accident rather than by design. But it was really, really helpful because I've gained first-hand experience of working with NQ candidates and placing them into law firms as they approach the qualification. Most recently, I have been running my own consultancy, which has 3 sort of main areas of focus. One is career coaching, second is business skills training, and then the third is, and the most recent sort of activity I've been involved in, is working as associate editor at a new careers and wellbeing website called cheeklittlecareers.com, where you'll also be able to find plenty of free information on managing your traineeships and your careers more generally. With regard to my experience in this space, i.e. supporting final seat trainees who are approaching qualification, just to reassure you, I will be 100% objective, because there is no hidden agenda. This isn't me running this session to promote my coaching work or to promote my recruitment activities. I don't do NQ recruitment anymore. And with regard to the support I offer final seat trainees, that work comes to me via law firms. So the anecdotes and stories I'm going to share with you will be real life examples drawn from the trainees that I've supported in the past. They total now 300. This is my 9th qualification round that I'm working as a career coach. It's separate to that, I also help to run the Law Society Careers Clinic. So I speak to trainees and more senior lawyers through my work running the clinic. And I can give you examples of some of the stories that I hear at that clinic, because often those individuals who make appointments have, I believe, made poor choices when it comes to qualification. So what I'm going to cover this afternoon, it's about 90 minutes this session. I'll be speaking for about an hour, and then we'll have half an hour's worth of Q&A. So what I'm going to talk about is choosing your preferred practice area, and the sort of factors you should consider before committing to that, and the importance of being a little bit more flexible about that. I will give you an objective and honest overview of the NQ jobs market, because there is quite a lot of conflicting information that circulates in the sort of trainee solicitor grapevine, so to speak. We'll look a little bit about internal interviews for those of you who have got interviews coming up, but the principles I'm going to talk about will apply equally well to external interviews, because I appreciate some of you will probably already be actively looking for external positions. And as I said, finally, we will spend about half an hour doing Q&A. So as is, hold on, there is a bit of a time delay. I have forwarded my slides, but it doesn't seem to be working. Let me start again, hold on. There you go. It will appear, there you go. So as is all things related to careers, or the case with all things related to careers, the starting point when it comes to planning and making choices is to have a conversation with yourself, okay? So that's what I mean by self-reflection. It's really important to have an honest sort of, give yourself an honest appraisal of what your training contract has been like, what's gone really well for you, what is there that needs doing to up your game. Because if you are only in the early stages of your training contract, or you are in your third seat rather than your penultimate or final seat, then it's equally important to do that reflection, because you've still got an opportunity to enhance your performance and therefore put yourself in a stronger position to get your first choice department when you enter the process internally, okay? It's also worth thinking about which seat you did, assuming that you've done a training contract that involves rotations. I appreciate that some of you may be training in-house and that's not always applicable. And the key is why. Why did you enjoy that seat? What I find when I speak to trainees is that often they will focus quite heavily on their colleagues and what the team was like. Oh, I really like the people. The issue with focusing on people solely is that people come and go. For me, it's more about what your day-to-day responsibilities entailed. What sort of clients did you get to work with? What sort of, how much client contact did you have? How much responsibility were you given? But remember, the work you do as a trainee solicitor will be quite different to what you'll do as an NQ and beyond. So as part of this process, it's also quite helpful, I think, to talk to some of the more senior people in your team or teams that you're interested in joining, just to get a feel for how their first year or second year went after they completed their traineeships. Obviously, it's important to, again, be realistic with regard to the feedback you've received in your end of seat appraisals, because I think that though most law firms now have quite robust internal qualification processes that include, you know, putting together a CV, an internal interview, case studies, etc., it's inevitable that your trainee appraisal grades are going to have a degree of influence over who gets the offer in the event that there are two strong performers during the interview process. The reason it's important to also think about your short, medium and long-term goals is that the legal sector is infamous for favouring candidates who have straightforward vanilla CVs. And that means candidates who have gaps or who qualify into one practice area and then want to switch will potentially get stuck. Equally, there are some practice areas that are going to be far better to specialise in if you want to ultimately move in-house or go and work overseas, for example. When thinking about what type of lawyer you ultimately want to become, one simple way of looking at this is to split the lawyers into three broad groups. So you've got the transactional, contentious, and advisory. Okay. Now, the reason I break it down like this rather than by specific departments is in a challenging jobs market, or where you've got teams within the firm that you're trading at that are heavily oversubscribed, if your heart is set on qualifying into corporate, it may be that banking is a good plan B or an alternative option for you because they are both transactional. Similarly, if you desperately want to be a litigator and litigation is looking oversubscribed, then logic would dictate that it's worth potentially looking at arbitration or perhaps a more specialist area within disputes. So it could be that you do construction disputes rather than general commercial litigation, or if you wanted to specialise in family work, contentious family law work, that you look at private clients or you look at wealth management. So the main thing is that the way, by splitting it into these three groups, what you're focusing more on is, are you someone who likes project-based work, or do you prefer black letter law? Is work-life balance important to you? In that case, then advisory might be better, because transactional is notorious for unpredictable hours. Contentious is really not that much better. Advisory is a bit calmer. And if you find that you like a little bit of everything, then there are obviously some practice areas that incorporate all three, employment and tax being a case in point. So think really carefully about what elements of your training contract you've enjoyed. Is it drafting? Is it negotiating? Is it dealing with a particular type of client? Do you like the sort of hustle and bustle of working in a busy transactional team? And that, I think, is a much more sensible way of helping you to narrow down choices, because some trainees are genuinely torn between different areas. So as I've already highlighted, ask yourself, what sort of lawyer do you want to be? And what would your typical day look like as you gain more PQE? So, if you are in a large corporate firm, for example, and you may find that you do quite a lot of processy work, whereas if you're trading in a much smaller firm, you may find that you're already getting to handle some of your own case files, and therefore you may find that as an NQ, your day-to-day responsibilities don't look massively different. But longer term, you may find that you will have a lot more client contact and work on more high-profile cases. Okay. The teams you've sat in will have a massive impact on where you end up qualifying into, because it is quite unusual for a trainee to qualify into a team or practice area that they've not gained exposure to during their training. It's not unheard of. I've seen this happen a few times, but it is unusual. Okay. Similarly, you'll find that if you've done a training contract where most of your seats have incorporated contentious work, then qualifying into a transactional area may be more of a challenge. And the trainee who's done their training contract the other way around would have the advantage in that situation. The final bullet point is really important. Remember that fundamentally you are a resource to a law firm. And when you're thinking about where you want to qualify into, it's worth being quite strategic about it, because the greater volume of vacancies are likely to prevail in the teams that are priority areas for the firm. And if you realise belatedly after you've started your training that actually you're in the wrong firm because you desperately want to specialise in one area of law and the firm you're at just isn't really investing any money into that team, then that would be a pretty compelling reason to potentially look externally. Just to pick up on this point about longer term goals and how this matches, these are the typical paths that lawyers tend to follow once they qualify. So you become a lifer, so you work at a law firm and you work towards partnership. or you move in-house, you spend some time overseas, or you move overseas on a permanent basis. You may find that you're training in London, you want to move to the regions to be closer to family. Similarly, if you're training in the regions, you may want to move to London. Or you may find that you want to stay put in London, but you want to downsize or join a US law firm. One I didn't mention is those of you who are training in-house, who potentially want to move into private practice, which I'll come on to shortly. So if you want to stay in law forever and you want to work towards partnership, then really there is no limit to what practice area you should be qualifying into. Although think about practice areas that are potentially at risk. So for example, I know areas like personal injury have been struggling because of how you fund personal injury claims. Employment, I think, can be difficult if you do claimant work because, again, legal aid has had an impact on that. So, in terms of areas that are quite busy at the moment, we're thinking sort of data protection, TMT, that's always quite buoyant. And the transactional practice areas tend to be busy all the time. And the other thing about partnership, when you link it to potentially moving away from London. So say, for example, you want to be a partner, but you also want to be a partner in a regional law firm, then qualifying into something like structured finance or derivatives is going to be difficult. So, there are some practice areas which are very, very London-centric. And that's why, again, it's important to think about where you want to be longer term. With regard to moving in-house, ultimately, the practice area you qualify into will have an influence over the sectors that you could potentially explore as an in-house lawyer. So, for example, if your heart is set on working for the likes of, I don't know, Amazon or Google, then areas that they will need lawyers will be in practice, it will be commercial, IP, TMT, compliance. They're quite helpful. But if you want to work in financial services, then and want to go and join an investment bank, then of course corporate or banking would be easier. The good thing about moving in-house is that a lot of in-house lawyers are generalists anyway, so it's that's worth bearing in mind when thinking about potentially moving in-house at some point. The other point to flag with regard to moving in-house is what I've raised earlier about those of you who are training in-house and who want to move into private practice. That is extremely difficult. Just to sort of flag that, and I can go into this more deeply if anyone has a specific question about that route in the Q&A part of the training contract. Now, why is this all really important? The reason being is that once you've committed to a practice area, it can be really difficult to change. And some trainees have done it because what they've done is qualified into a second choice because the team they desperately wanted to join had no space. But what they had to do was move within about 6 to 9 months of being qualified. And even then, a lot of them had to tap into their network to get their get noticed, because a lot of recruiters will walk away saying, sorry, but you don't have the relevant experience for what my client is after. Okay. The good thing is that in smaller firms where lawyers tend to be more generalists, it is a bit easier. So the more elite you go, the harder it is to switch practice areas. And if you go in-house, then chances are you'll end up becoming a generalist anyway. Similarly, you'll find that if your training contract is quite sort of public sector focused, then you may struggle to get into a law firm that does commercial work. So the matching process is both to do with practice areas, but also sector and the type of firm that you've trained with. So, for example, it's going to be pretty challenging if you're working in a really tiny, weeny law firm in the regions to then go into a big city law firm. You may find that initially targeting a London law firm will work, and then moving on again to something a bit bigger. So you have to do it in stages rather than in one fell swoop. let's talk a little bit about the internal process now. The main point about the internal process is that no firm has got it quite right in terms of timing and in terms of how they manage the process. But the main point is that firms are trying their, as much as possible to make the process fair. So you'll find that it will be quite formal, but that doesn't mean you just run with the process. It's really important to get to work on your network, identify who your cheerleaders and ambassadors are going to be, and make sure that they have your back. Similarly, make sure that the partners in the teams that you're particularly interested in joining, or at least senior associates, are aware of your intentions, particularly if the team you want to join was one you spent time in the earlier stages of your training contract. Don't assume that they remember who you are, especially if you haven't maintained regular contact with them since moving on to your next seat. It's really important to take the process internally seriously. That means making sure that you've done plenty of prep for your internal interviews, which I'll come on to later. If you are thinking about looking externally, either after you've exhausted the internal process or simultaneously, then it's really important to make sure that you have a recruiter-friendly LinkedIn profile. And that really is quite simple. It just makes sure that it's clear when you're going to be qualifying, and set your privacy options so that recruiters are able to contact you. Be realistic, okay? As I said, law firms are businesses and you're a resource. And any hiring that will be made by the firm will ultimately depend on business need. So as I've said, if your practice area that you want to qualify into is looking likely to be oversubscribed, then it's really important to have a think about what your alternative option would be, okay? Now, if qualifying into an alternative practice area seems a little bit unpalatable to you, you need to form your opinion on how that compares to what the external situation is like. And this is why it's important, whether you proactively decide to go and look for an external role or not, that it's worth your while to just pick up the phone to a couple of friendly recruiters just to get their view on what the market is looking like. Because that will then enable you to do that fine balancing act of, do I take the risk of looking externally, or do I qualify into a second choice practice area, knowing that that's also a risk, in that I might then get pigeonholed as a banking lawyer and my heart was set on qualifying into IP. Okay. So let's look at the external NQ jobs market. Suffice to say that last summer, I was lying awake worrying about the trainees on my outplacement and career coaching program, because the usual rules that I would adopt when looking for an external NQ position no longer seemed irrelevant, because the market had pretty much collapsed. Okay. The good news is that the jobs market has bounced back, and all you've got to do is look at the legal press to see stories about quite a lot of firms now repaying furlough monies. They have, certainly started recruiting again at the more sort of experienced end. Okay, so there are more roles. The market has picked up, but even without a pandemic going on in the background, I do not know a single qualification round during my time of being a recruiter and a career coach where firms just couldn't get enough NQs. Unfortunately, the volume of roles is always quite low in comparison to the number of candidates looking. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And because when I say this, a lot of trainees look at me thinking you're talking nonsense, because I've been inundated with emails from recruiters who want to chat to me about NQ opportunities, okay? So the reason why there are so many candidates is because you've got some who are window shopping and have no intention of moving firms. You've got some who are serious about looking, but might ultimately not move anyway. And then you've got those who are actively looking. So you've got lots of candidates after slightly different things. And you've obviously got candidates who have got offers and who are seriously looking to move potentially to get an uplift in their salary, or because the firm that they're at just wasn't culturally a right fit for them, okay? So that's why there are so many candidates vying for those positions. The reason why the volume of roles looks greater than is the case is because recruiters use qualification as an opportunity to harvest CVs. So what they'll do is they'll put on presentations for trainees, they'll send you emails saying, let's talk about the NQ jobs market. And what they're doing is that a key performance target that they have to meet is a X number of candidates added to their database. And this path is well trodden, i.e. email final seat trainees and show them a bit of love and attention, and you'll hear their entire career history and you'll be able to add it to their database. And then you'll know that in 6 months' time, you'll be able to pick the phone up to them and say, oh, I remember speaking to you when you were coming up for qualification. You mentioned that at some point you might want to move in-house. I've got the perfect role for you. And that's how it works. So that's one reason why you're getting lots of attention from recruiters. And the other reason why the market looks inflated is because recruiters are a bit sneaky, and what they'll do is blur the line between what is a live role, which has been budgeted for by the hiring organisation, versus a speculative approach, because the recruiter was given a tip off by the partner saying, we're not actively recruiting, but if you see a stellar trainee who's looking for an NQ job, then I'd be interested. And they, by stellar, they mean candidates from particular firms. For those of you who are final seat trainees at the moment, you'll know that we're now smack bang in the middle of the process. And the external market runs on a similar timeline to the internal. So vacancies will start getting released around May, and it will go all the way through to August, even until September. Where do the vacancies have come up? So an organisation is more likely to recruit an NQ because they don't have their own trainees. And that's essentially what a lot of American firms are doing in London. The next group will be firms that do have their own trainees, but perhaps they didn't hire enough, because obviously law firms recruit so far in advance and they don't necessarily know what their needs are going to be once those trainees qualify. Or it could be that there are some departments that were just undersubscribed because the trainees all wanted to qualify into IP and no one wanted employment. So there's always a perennial mismatch between where trainees want to qualify and where the vacancies exist. And it's that mismatch that you could take advantage of, because that's where the vacancies are likely to be. But it's not the same as applying for training contracts. Let's just put that out there. You can't just pull up a list of firms that you want to apply to because they look attractive. The reality is that those firms aren't going to be recruiting because they've got their own trainees, or they just don't need any NQs at the moment because they've already hired quite a few. So that's why it's not a simple case of I'm going to just select 10 firms and I'm going to just apply to them. It's very much a vacancies driven type job search. I've already started telling you about some of the sneaky stuff that recruiters do. So let me tell you how you find a recruiter. The agencies are really vast in numbers and vary in size, okay? You've got the big agencies like Taylor Root, SSQ, and then you've got boutiques where it's literally one man with his mobile phone, okay? A bit like what I did before I moved away from recruitment to do career coaching. It was just me literally with my laptop and mobile phone. So what's the difference? Big agencies will give you a much bigger spread of clients and will have a higher volume of roles, but their candidate care might be a little bit all over the place. The boutiques tend to be more candidate-led and will give you lots of love and attention, but the coverage will be fairly limited, meaning that they're more likely to be selective about which candidates they're going to give a love and attention to, because they tend to look for candidates that are a better match for the few clients they represent. With regard to how many agencies should you be speaking to, there isn't really a number, so to speak. And you may find that some people say to you, oh, you mustn't register with too many, and otherwise you will look desperate. The reality is that if you actively are looking for an NQ job because you risk not having a job when you qualify, then you need to cast your net quite wide. And no one will think you're desperate if you don't tell them that you're talking to lots of different agencies. So it's really more about what you say to each recruiter rather than how many you speak to, okay? It's worth picking up the phone to speaking to a couple of recruiters first, but you may find that with some agencies, they just prefer you to submit the CV first and they'll call you back. When you do speak to recruiters, remember that it's really important to present the best version of yourself, because in a competitive jobs market, which is the case for NQ jobs, you'll find that recruiters can cherry pick who they want to prioritise and give the most attention to, okay? Remember when you speak to recruiters, you need to micromanage them and really impress upon them that you don't want your CV circulated to any employers without your prior written permission. Now, another rookie error is where trainees say, oh, I'm going to work with X recruiter, he's lovely, or she's really nice and really responsive. A recruiter can be really lovely, but the reality is that if they don't work for the types of employers that would be a good fit for what you're after, then they're going to be of very little use to you, and the relationship will inevitably just fizzle out. So you need to really ensure that the recruiter that you are speaking to works for the types of law firms that you would want to be put forward for. It's also worth remembering, by the way, that usually recruitment agencies are split into the private practice desk and then the in-house desk. So you'll need to speak to each separately, depending on what you want to prioritise as part of your search. So follow the vacancies rather than being, drawn towards recruiters who are friendly. Now, as I've already said, recruiters do sometimes fudge what's going on and blur that line between live roles and speculative. It's just get the recruiter to clarify what's going on, okay? Speculative approaches are less likely to result in an interview and only really work if there's rhyme or reason for this recruiter to send the CV. And it could be because, as I said, the recruiter's been tipped off about a role by a partner directly, or it could be that the recruiter has placed, a string of other NQs into that team from the same firm that you're training at, okay? Now, the other final point I wanted to make about recruiters is make sure you stay in regular contact with them, because, again, when lots of trainees are trying to vie to get their attention, the risk is that the recruiters are going to favour the really sort of the candidates who are, responsive, who have strong CVs and who are from the more elite firms. So for trainees from smaller firms will have to try a little bit harder sometimes. And remember to keep a paper trail, okay? Because one of the other reasons you'll be advised against working with too many recruiters is this risk of duplicate applications happening. By that I mean that a law firm receives your CV from 2 different agencies. It's not a deal breaker, but it can, leave you feeling a little bit embarrassed or awkward. And, law firms just don't like it. But if it does happen, and trust me, it does quite a lot, please don't panic. It's really not a big deal. The recruiters will work it out amongst themselves. So Now we've worked out how you're going to find recruiters, just to sort of pick up on some of the things that I've missed from the previous slide. Make sure that, as I said, you're in sell mode. Get your story straight, especially how you're going to respond to whether or not you've got an internal offer. The lack of internal offer isn't a deal breaker, just to reassure you. Have an advanced draft of your CV ready to go, because sometimes they play a bit like, you know, chicken and egg, that they won't talk to you until you've got a CV, okay? Be realistic. What recruiters like are candidates who have gone off and done the reality checking in advance of picking up the phone to them, because recruiters don't like candidates who are overly selective and, you know, just keep saying no to everything. That said, they can be a little bit pushy themselves. So just make sure that you stand your ground, okay? Show them some loyalty, because, you know, as much as we dislike recruiters, they play a really important role in this whole process, you know, in terms of managing the, you know, the day-to-day search for you, giving you inside information on the teams that they're putting you forward for. They can help with interview prep, all of that stuff, okay? Now, be honest and open with them, but don't give them tip-offs unwittingly. So, for example, when they screen you, chances are they'll ask you, who else have you applied to? Or, you know, who's your CV with? And one reason they're asking that is, of course, legitimate, which is they want to make sure that you know, they don't put you forward for the same roles. But they're also fishing for information, because what they're looking for is potential leads that they're not aware of. And if you've been put forward, they obviously can't put you forward. But what they're going to do is find another candidate on their database and then put the other candidate forward. And what you've done is, sadly, created competition for yourself. And do return their calls and emails, even if it's to politely say, not for me. And, you know, share the roles with your friends, help each other out, because that will also earn you a bit of loyalty back from the recruiter. Let's move on to CV tips. By the way, I'm covering quite a lot in this presentation, which is why I'm not going into too much detail on any of it, because I want to just give you a really big overview of the whole process. But let's move on to CVs now. Length is something that so many lawyers I speak to and trainees, they're obsessed about it. There is no prescribed length for a CV, but 2 to 3 pages is standard. And the reason why NQs need longer CVs is because I'd like to see a fair bit of detail on their experience gained in each seat, okay? Now, key sections to include will be the academics, and I would put that at the top, unless you're trying to bury a slightly lower degree grade, then you may want to push that to the bottom of your CV. Similarly, if you're a mature candidate or a career changer, then you may get away with having your academics at the end of your CV. And then your career history, summary of seat choices. This is really where the bulk of the space is going to be used up by. What I want to see is your initial summary, which will then give you the freedom to write down your experience by relevance rather than by date order. And it needs to be broken down into each seat. And if you're working for a firm where you get to do bigger ticket stuff, then it's a good way to describe your work is by pegging it to individual projects or matters. And if you work on smaller things, then I would split it by sort of different tasks, okay? But what I don't want to see is a list of responsibilities, because that then looks like a job description. What I really want is a summary of your experience that focuses on achievements, accomplishments, you know, successful cases you've been involved in, positive feedback you've received from supervisors, etc. Now, if there's space, then BD is now a nice addition to your CV, as is pro bono, especially if, for example, you want to qualify into a disputes-related area and you've done some disputes work in your pro bono seat, then that's also really helpful. And hobbies and interests, frankly, are more relevant when you're a student looking for a training contract, because a lot of the discussions at the interviews are going to be centered around that. Whereas now, really what the partners care the most about is what you really want to be, you know, what you've done in the 2 years of your training. And the bulk of that, again, should focus on the areas that are most relevant to the practice area you want to end up qualifying into. Right, so that's CVs. By the way, once you've done your CV, you may want to do an abridged version for your LinkedIn profile. Now let's talk about interviews. Quite a common misunderstanding when it comes to interviews is lots of trainees I've supported think that the interview is going to be competency-based. And they go spend hours preparing competency-based answers, much like they did when they were applying for training contracts. The problem is that it's unlikely that it will be in a competency-based interview. Most of the trainees I've worked with through my outplacement program, their interviews have been more conversational and CV focused, and they typically get broken down into motivational questions. So questions that will enable the interviewer to get a better idea of who you are and what's motivated you to apply to their firm, what's motivated you to want to specialise in competition law or wills and probate. And that will also then go on to things like longer term goals and plans, why you've enjoyed certain aspects of your training contract, and so on. But the bulk of the interview is going to focus on technical and I say competency-based questions because you'll find that you may not necessarily get asked an explicit competency style question. What you might get is something more general, which is, Husnara, I noticed that you advised on the Deliveroo IPO, or you were in the team that advised on the Deliveroo IPO. Can you talk me through that? Okay, so they've obviously not referred to any competencies, but it's pretty obvious to me, and it should be to you, that what they want you to do is talk them through what your role was on that and what competencies you were able to enhance or develop by being involved in that work, okay? So a common rookie error that a lot of trainees have made when doing interviews is they sit there waiting for the interviewer to ask them competency questions. What is a much better way of dealing with these types of skills and competencies is actually to weave them into the more general open-ended questions they're likely to ask you, so that you volunteer up your competencies that you feel are your greatest strengths, okay? Another technical, another way that interviewers might test your technical development is where they ask you a question about the law, okay? So make sure that as part of your interview prep, not only are you really familiar with all the deals or cases or matters you've been involved in, it's really important that you know the bare basic principles of the law that relates to your practice area. So for example, with employment law, I would expect you to understand how unfair dismissal works, or how you would manage a whistleblowing case. For corporate, I would expect you to understand what the difference is between a warranty and an indemnity and what the key provisions are in a share purchase agreement. For a disputes role, I would expect you to understand the basic rules of privilege and disclosure and what the remedies are for breach of contract, okay? So it is a bit like preparing for an exam, but you'll find that the questions you get asked are broadly linked to the cases or the matters you've been involved in. So that should give you clues as to what areas of law you should be doing some preparation on. Okay, and then the interview would usually be wrapped up by you getting an opportunity to ask the interviewers questions. Now, with the questions you have for the interviewers, for me, there are certain principles that apply. Firstly, they should be questions that give, that you're genuinely interested in hearing the answers on. Okay. Secondly, if you feel that the interview hasn't given you enough opportunity to demonstrate your technical development, your questions could centre around the work the partners you're interviewed by are working on, because that will then give you an opportunity to talk again about the work, about the law, etc., etc. But if you feel that you've been probed enough about the law, then I would park that and just leave that well alone. And then finally, think about questions that will enable you to use positive sort of, body language or, phrases such as, thank you for that, that really resonates with me, or that's really aligned to what I was thinking, or no, that's really interesting and I would love to be involved in cases like that, etc., etc. Because what you're doing essentially is, remember that in an interview, what the partners are most likely to remember will be your opening and your, the last few things that you discuss, which is why it's really important to think how you could manipulate the questions you ask the interviewers to potentially give yourself a final opportunity to sell to the interviewers. So fail-safe questions, for example, would be centered around training, the team's strategy going forward, what the firm's stance is on, returning to the office going forward, all of that sort of stuff. And if all else fails, you'll probably already know this, get the partners talking about themselves. They love it. And it always works a treat. And that's actually a really good way of also using those phrases I've just given you, like, that sounds really fascinating, or that's exactly what has motivated me to apply to your firm. So before the interview, as I said, know your CV inside out. The research you do has to be threefold. Research on yourself, so that will enable you to, research and preparation, I guess, on yourself. So answers to those motivational type questions, which I'll come on to in the next bullet point. Then you've got research into the area of law that you're going to specialise in. And, it's kind of advanced LPC, so please don't think you need to be the finished product, okay? And then thirdly, research into the firm or in-house legal team that you're going to be interviewing, okay? The good thing about qualified lawyer interviews is that you'll be given the names of the interviewers in advance, which isn't the case for training contracts. So you can look the interviewers up as well. So look up the individuals as part of your preparation, because the more prepared you are, the more confident you'll feel. The two things go hand in glove. Now, for me, the best way to really wow an interviewer is to come up with that killer opening answer that really sets the stall up, or, sets the scene on what you're about. And it also reduces the risk of leaving you exposed to that curveball technical question. So what you're doing is answering that general, so why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, by coming up with a couple of really key sort of selling points that are quite unique to you. But one of those, the third bullet point, should relate to a piece of work that you're involved in, okay? Now, you'll know if your messages are strong enough, memorable enough, and unique enough if you conclude that no one else can use your answer. If your friend along the corridor can use the same answer, then it's too generic. Now, although I said that you don't need to have those competency, you're unlikely to be asked a direct competency style question, it's still worth your while preparing a case file with examples of the work you've been involved in over the past 18 months or so, and then tagging to that piece of work what skill or competency you were able to develop by being involved in that piece of work. Because another common rookie error is the way competency style questions are answered, which results in the answer being a little bit underwhelming because it's a little bit too generic. I'll show you so let's talk about the case file. So what your case file should incorporate, I think, is these are the most common skills and attributes or competencies that law firms look for in their NQs, okay? So what I would quite like you to have by the end of your preparation time is some really concrete examples of work that you've been involved in, preferably during your training contract and preferably with regard to client work, that helps you to develop all of those key areas. Okay, if you are struggling, then I will allow you to go as far back as uni, but sixth form to historic. Okay, I don't need to go through what each of these competencies covers because they're pretty self-explanatory, but it's a really helpful exercise. It's quite cathartic in that you'll find that it will help you to regain some confidence as well if you feel a little bit sort of unsettled with what's going on with qualification at the moment. So just a bit more on technical questions. Familiarise yourself with the key matters. Do your background reading, and remember, as well as giving an overview of what that matter was, it's really important to mention your contribution. So all you've got to do is make that tiny tweak by saying, I did this, or I led, I advised, I coordinated, I managed, rather than we did this and our client did that. Okay. If a question doesn't make sense, be brave and just ask for clarification. Okay. And if you're still unsure, just offer a qualified response. Use a caveat, and usually that will result in the partners giving you some prompts to guide you to the correct answer. And if it does go a bit pear-shaped, please try not to be too harsh on yourself. Okay, it's really important not to catastrophize, because you'll find that really you'll get away with that if you maintain your composure. I was talking to a trainee literally a few hours ago, and he thought he'd messed up his technical answer and was being really negative, and he got an offer because he managed to hold it together for the rest of the interview. And remember what I said about the recency and primacy effect, that they're more likely to remember the beginning of your interview answers than the end. So don't throw the towel in this, I guess, the advice I'm giving you. So during the interview itself, be sure to strike the right tone. I think you've got to be pretty brave to start joking and stuff, and don't fall into another trap. Okay, if it is an internal interview you're having, or it's an interview with people you know, and you find that the conversation becomes a little bit informal, you might feel good immediately after the interview, but you may then find that you feel a bit flat afterwards because you realise that you didn't mention those key messages that you had prepared. In fact, I can tell you that I've had more trainees say to me that they've not managed to convert an informal chat into a second round or an offer than trainees who have managed to convert an interview where they perhaps messed up one answer and they still converted it to a second round or an offer. So those informal chatty interviews are really dangerous, and therefore it's worth making sure that you weave into your answers those key messages, no matter how friendly or chatty the partners are. Okay. Now, a lot of trainees don't know when to stop their answers because they just waffle and then dilute a perfectly strong answer, or they don't develop their answers far enough. Okay. So the way to structure your answers is to break them down to 3 bullet points. That can be 3 words, 3 lines, or 3 paragraphs. Don't say you're about to make 3 points because you're bound to forget the 3rd point. These are just imaginary bullet points in your head. And you'll find that, I mean, for me, this has been the biggest game changer for the trainees I've been supporting. They say they find that it adds structure to their answers. It forces you to slow down, which enables the interviewer to interrupt you and ask a follow-up question if appropriate. And it makes the answer, the right length. So it is a win-win. It's a really good way to answer questions when you feel that you waffle. The card technique, I've got a separate slide on that, so I'll park that for the moment. Sorry, that wasn't an intended pun, by the way, park the car. So, as I said, use I instead of we. Pause and think before you speak. Just don't blurt out the first thing that comes to your mind, because chances are you've got a stronger answer, okay? And watch your body language, especially on virtual interviews. If you're like me, my eyes are all over the place most of the time. or I lean forward too much, I'm too close to the computer, etc. So that's worth remembering. But in terms of virtual interviews, all the principles of doing an interview still apply. The one thing that you can do, which you can't with a live interview in person, is to have notes in front of you. Because you could have notes on your desk and the partners will be none the wiser, or you could split your screen. So have a think about what you're going to do with regard to notes and whether you can do that. The other stuff is the usual, make sure the tech is working, you know, in terms of sound, internet. If you're sharing your flat or house with other people, let them know that you're doing an interview, and if your phone is synchronized to your laptop, put your phone on airplane mode, because this has happened to me a few times where I've been presenting live events and my phone starts ringing through my laptop, which is embarrassing. But yeah, so those are really the main points about virtual interviews. We've now been living in a virtual world for quite a while, so I'm hoping that you're all now quite the experts in this area. So as I said, I was going to look at CAR separately. So CAR essentially is an alternative to what you're probably more familiar with, which is the STAR technique, which was situation, task, action, result. The CAR technique, as the slide shows, is context, action, result. And it abides by that 3 bullet point principle. So what the context is essentially is setting the scene. Action is, as I said, what you did. So using I did this, and then R is the result. And it really is as simple as that. But the harder bit is coming up with those really specific examples rather than general themes centered around your training contract. So that, for me, works. The other thing that you could do, if you felt that it was appropriate, is you could add a T to the word and turn it into cart. And it works wonders when you're talking about the sort of takeaways. So the T stands for takeaways. And that's really lessons learned, because an area that partners are paying more attention on is future behaviours and what you'd be doing going forward, rather than past behaviours, because not everyone will have had the same opportunities to shine because of doing a training contract during a pandemic and doing most of it remotely. I've covered the questions for the interviewers in fair bits of detail already. Is this slide going to appear today? Come on. I have no idea why. Let's start again, hold on. There you go. So as I said, ask questions that you are genuinely interested in. If the answer is readily available from other sources, it's likely to be too basic, okay? I've mentioned the foolproof answers, which is the longer term plans, training opportunities, expectations for NQs is another good one. And as I said, alternatively, get partners talking about their experiences. Things not to ask are questions around money. I would avoid questions relating to work-life balance. I would talk more generally about culture. And the point about the expectations from NQs is that that gives you an opportunity to find out things like what the level of support is going to be like. And that's especially important for trainees going to firms that are quite small. So should you stay or should you go? I honestly don't know. It's such a personal choice and it depends on so many different factors, okay, and your individual circumstances. So as I said, talk to recruiters to get a gauge for what's going on externally. Then you can do a direct comparison to what the internal offer looks like compared to the external offer you've received, okay? And remember, it's all about matching what you do now so that you've set yourself up to be able to meet your longer term goals, because there are certain choices that could be career limiting, okay? And then the final question to ask yourself is, how would an objective bystander view the move? Would they see it as a, you know, backward step, or would they see it as a step up? And remember, you only need to explain your decision for moving in the first place if you choose to move on, further down the line from the role that you join. And you may find that it's unnecessary, and it becomes, if you move and you stay in the role that you for a while, then your reason for moving as an NQ becomes less relevant. If you do miss out on an internal role, it's really important not to panic or to take it personally, and don't just go all silent on the grad rec team or the sort of grad development team at your firm or the partners, okay? Because often they can potentially come to arrangements which might involve a fixed term contract or a secondment, etc. Okay, so it's really important to make sure that they are still in contact with you, so that any of those opportunities that come up could be then run by you. Okay, and remember, this is a business decision. So it's, once you remove emotion away from it, you'll find that it'll be easier to process the information and what's going on. And if you do miss out on the internal, as I said, it's not a deal breaker in terms of looking for an external role, but there are certain mitigating steps you'll need to take to reassure a recruiter that your reason for not having an internal offer is purely resourcing requirements for your firm rather than because you underperformed. So what you could do, for example, is get your appraisals and hand them over to the recruiter. Obviously, you need to redact them first, or you may find that the partners that weren't able to offer you a job could offer to provide references for you and put in a good word. So that's really important to be able to think of that. When you do explain the internal role, you don't need to go into all the gory details, and you certainly shouldn't be saying things that are overly negative about your firm. Focus on the positives, that yes, you're disappointed, but this is a fantastic opportunity for you to explore the market and move to a firm that's going to be a better match for you in terms of your sort of short-term goals. And there you go. Exactly at 3 o'clock, I finished the presentation. So I'm going to turn the slides off. And I'm very happy now to take questions from anyone on anything relating to being an NQ, on qualification, whatever really.
Got a question from Raphael.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
My question is, would we be prejudiced if we decide after qualification to undertake a master's degree to specialize in a particular area of practice and then come back after the master's to look for a newly qualified position, or would that not be recommended?
Really, really good question, and thank you for that, because I should have touched upon this already. So look, let me talk about what happens if you don't have an NQ job, full stop. Okay, I would strongly advise any of you to have a big gap on your CV. Okay, you're much better off qualifying into something broadly related to where you want to be, and then you continue looking. If you end up with a couple of months gap, that's absolutely fine. No reason to panic. Now, with regard to masters, it's a good plan B for certain practice areas. Okay, and the ones that jump out to me are things like arbitration and competition law. So practice areas that are quite heavily academic. And if you look at the firms that you're potentially interested in joining after you've done your masters, if every partner at that firm, and in fact every associate, has all got 3 degrees, including a master's, then that would be a good way of assessing whether it's worth your while. Okay, if you want to be a transactional lawyer, then adding a master's to your CV is going to add very little value. Does that help, Raphael?
Yeah, I was going to add, that's very helpful. In an area, for example, I mean, my particular area of interest is data protection and cybersecurity, that I know is considered to be up and coming and niche. Would it be worthwhile, even though I know that obviously the practical experience is significantly valuable, but then there's obviously a very technical, perhaps academic side to it that, you know, would require greater understanding and learning from many institutions up and down the country that offer programs now in this master's specialty.
I think that, as I said, ultimately, this is a choice that partners will fundamentally have to make. And if you've already identified firms that you want to join after your masters, do a bit of people snooping and see what the academic backgrounds are of the individual partners that you would potentially be approaching after your masters. And if they've all done masters, then they clearly would favour a candidate who's got quite an academic CV. But my gut tells me that most partners prefer practical, real life experience of being an NQ over a postgraduate qualification.
Thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
All right, question from Sujal.
Hi. Oh, hello. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes,
We can.
Hi,
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, Husnara. Thank you so much for today. Everything you've said has been very interesting and, you know, pretty much what I've wanted to hear from someone and get advice on. I've got quite a different story in terms of how I've got into law. So I work for a tech company currently, and I'm the very first trainee. And being the company that I'm at, you know, I've had the privilege of doing, you know, the seat rotations and doing an external reverse secondment at a US firm. So when I'm approaching, you know, my NQ position, so I'm in my third seat currently, and, you know, I have an option to stay at the company that I'm at. But I wanted to know if I do want to go into private practice and approach recruiters, I've got a feeling that many recruiters will, you know, consider my in-house experience being, you know, a generic in-house experience where you don't have the seat rotation, you are more of a generalist. Whereas the experience I've had, it's very private practice driven. And I've worked very closely with the panel firms that we've got. So how would I in this, you know, situation market myself to be able to, you know, potentially go into private practice? And also, is it, you know, being an in-house trainee, you know, going forward, I do want to, you know, settle and work in-house, but is it a requirement to be an all-rounded lawyer to have a private practice experience on your CV, or with the experience that I've got at, you know, a very big tech company, good enough? Would that qualify me as being matching to my peers?
I think that, well, let's break the question down to a few points. Number one, going from an in-house training contract into private practice, you'll find that you'll get a lot of pushback from recruiters. They'll be like, nah, not interested. Okay. One thing, so what I would recommend in that situation is to bypass the recruiters and to speak to very discreetly the panel firms that you've had exposure to. Okay. Because I know one trainee in my network who trained in-house at a very large FTSE 100 company. He tried desperately hard to move into private practice. And he told me that he'd spoke to scores of recruiters and not one of them would give him the time of day. And then he basically made a direct application via a partner he knew at a firm that was close to the client that he was training at, and he got the job.
Okay.
So you need to become your own recruiter. And I think it's worth highlighting this point that if you do have an unconventional CV, you will have much less success finding a job through a recruiter. And I've not really spoken too much this afternoon about networking. It is fundamentally important that you work those contacts and secure leads that haven't made it to the recruiters. And that's really what the hidden jobs market is all about. So that's part one of your question answered. Now, with regard to sort of if you want to be in-house longer term, is there any point in going into private practice and vice versa? I think if you're already in-house and you enjoy being in-house, then frankly, I think you should just stick with it.
Okay.
You know, I don't think you're going to be a lesser lawyer because as an in-house lawyer, you're not really going to ever be, you know, the next sort of, you know, guru on anything, because in-house lawyers don't have, you know, that they're not there for their, you know, outstanding technical skills. You're there to manage the relationship between the, you know, you're there to help the business manage risk, and anything that gets really complex goes to external advisors. So, and as you become more senior as an in-house lawyer, you'll become more of a manager.
Okay.
And, you know, these sort of reverse secondments work, and, you know, you could go off and do more training separately through your panel firms, etc. But yeah, so if you were in a smaller organisation, you were perhaps enjoying the work, or you know, you weren't getting as much supervision, then there'd be compelling reasons to maybe move on to a different team. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to move on to a law firm. It could just be a different legal function, because some law firm legal functions are bigger than law firms.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, it does. It does clarify. I think my biggest fear was, you know, the technical knowledge that you would get at private practice and the softer skills you learn in private practice, compared to, you know, always putting out fires when you're working in-house. Because like you rightly mentioned, you know, you're always concerned about the risk of your client constantly. So no, it makes sense what you said.
Yeah, if you want to be an in-house lawyer longer term, then, you know, you will just learn more anyway. I think that one of the reasons why a lot of trainees I speak to panic about qualification is, you know, and then the imposter syndrome kicks in and self-limiting beliefs and all of that stuff, is they look at the more senior people around them and think, oh my God, I don't know anything compared to this person. But you will just continue learning as you gain experience. So don't ever think, any of you, that once you finish your training contract, that's it, your learning stops.
Thanks so much.
Any more questions? As I said, it can be on anything to do with being a trainee or an NQ. It doesn't have to be about qualification.
Got a question from Madeline.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Hi, Husnara. Thank you so much for this this webinar. It's been really, really helpful. I was wondering what your views are about PQE like requirements. So often on job ads, you sort of see 2 years PQE, 3 years PQE. You rarely see like NQ, if that makes sense. So I was just wondering, like, what sort of appropriate is, like, could I apply for those jobs, or is that just not realistic?
I think, again, a brilliant question, so well done. Yeah, it's really difficult to sometimes decipher whether a role is going to be suitable or not. And you'll find that, you know, do you just rule yourself out? I personally think that if it's referring to, for in-house roles, if the job title refers to things like junior legal counsel, and it's 1 to 3 years PQE, then it's worth a shot. I think for private practice, if it's sort of 1 to 2 years PQE or 0 to 2 years, the chances are that the 2-year PQE is going to have a stronger shot at getting the interview. But there's a strong chance that you could get an interview as an NQ, and I've seen this happen quite a lot, simply because there are far fewer 2-year PQE candidates on the market, because that at that point people feel quite settled and they don't want to move. And a law firm has to weigh up the choice of going for a passive candidate that a recruiter has literally had to pluck out of the role that they're currently in, versus an NQ candidate who's actively looking. But it also depends on your CV and who the hiring organisation is, because if it's a combined effect of a PQE that's higher than what you're at, plus a firm that's really elite and quite selective about where they take trainees from, then you're going to have a much lower chance of getting an interview. But there is an element of you've got to take a punt.
Okay, so I guess it depends on the company or firm. I guess, like, if it's Magic Circle, you probably have to stick to it quite religiously, but if it's a smaller in-house function, then you could, like, give it a shot.
Yeah, ask yourself the common sense question: is this employer going to be is this a highly desirable employer? Are they going to be inundated with CVs? Okay, if it's a really small up and coming business
Mhm.
or law firm that no one's heard the name of, then it's going to be far less competitive getting into that firm than it is to get into, Queen Emanuel as a litigator.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
So Giles, did you have another question, or have you just forgotten to put your hand down?
Oops, sorry, I'll put it down now.
Okay. Any more questions?
What do you think, Rita? Should we just wrap up then?
I was going to say, it literally looks like you've covered everything.
Yeah.
If someone's got any questions, yeah.
I'll give my voice a rest because I was starting to cough,
Yes.
having this being my second webinar of the day. Oh, no, we have got a hand up, actually.
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question, because I missed the start. I was just wondering whether this will be recorded and put online anywhere, or?
It will be, yes, it will be recorded. Yeah.
Oh.
When available, the recording will be sent to all delegates.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Right, so any other questions?
No, I think that's it. So I guess from my perspective, do have a look at my website, Chief Political Careers, because there's quite a lot of help on there as well for NQs and final seat trainees. And there's a whole page dedicated to skills, etc., all available for free, because there's very little information available. Obviously, you've also got the content of the Law Society website as well. Other than that, I just don't think there's much available by way of content that's specifically aimed at your audience, because a lot of it is about how to get a training contract, or it's targeting much more senior people. And a lot of the content that is put out for trainees coming up for qualification will be those recruitment agencies that are looking to get you registered and added to their database. And often what they can say is a little bit biased. So thank you very much for listening in. I think Rita's going to just wrap up now. Over to you, Rita.
Yeah, just thank you, Husnara. Really good advice and tips, and thank you all for attending and participating. I hope you found all the tips shared quite valuable. Before you do leave, could you just take a moment to complete the poll question that will appear on the screen, which is hopefully in the next second or so. There should be a poll question to complete. And other than that, I'll say the webinar's come to an end.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, yes, there's the poll question.
Can I vote for myself?